The southern tip of the Florida Peninsula is a wonderfully unique place. Its fascinating ecology and subtropical climate have more in common with the Caribbean than they do with the rest of North America. In the interior lies the world-renowned Everglades, the River of Grass, a vast wetland that supports a variety of unusual ecosystems. On the east coast of the peninsula tip, where the wetlands meet the Atlantic Ocean, is a place of equal interest that is often overlooked. In 1968, part of this area was set aside as Biscayne National Monument by the Congress of the United States to preserve and protect for the education, recreation, and enjoyment of this and future generations a rare combination of terrestrial, marine, and amphibious life in a tropical setting of great natural beauty. It was enlarged and elevated to national park status in 1980. The area protected by Biscayne National Park is composed of four major elements. Its western boundary is just inland from the peninsula's eastern shore, incorporating the longest stretch of undeveloped mangrove shoreline on the east coast of Florida and the United States. Leaves falling from these mangroves are the basis of an estuarine food chain that supports an incredible variety of marine life in Biscayne Bay and surrounding waters. Unlike the deep waters of the ocean, which tend to be very dark and relatively inaccessible, the clear, shallow waters of Biscayne Bay are penetrated by light, which supports the growth of hosts of unusual, valuable, and rare wildlife, which is often visible from the surface. This is the location of the northern islands of the Florida Keys, a chain of fossilized coral reef islands that are covered by lush subtropical forest. And on the eastern edge of the park lies the northernmost living hard coral reef tract in the United States, an area whose rich biodiversity is second only to the great rainforests of the world. In the summer of 1992, the National Park Service had a number of facilities at Biscayne National Park to support its administrative, resource management, protective, and interpretive responsibilities. The headquarters area at Convoy Point on the mainland included a temporary visitor center, administrative offices, maintenance structures, docks, and offices for a concessionaire who offered tours in glass-bottom boats. New, permanent buildings were under construction to house administrative offices and maintenance facilities, and plans were being laid for a new visitor center. Adams Key had once been in private hands. Several small buildings, built as homes in the 20s, housed a resident ranger couple and an environmental education center. Docks, nature trails, maintenance support facilities, public restrooms, and a picnic area completed the island's facilities. Elliott Key was the site of a boat harbor, a visitor center, picnic areas, nature trails, primitive campgrounds, 2 ranger residences, and maintenance support facilities. And on Boca Chica Key, once the exclusive playground of the rich, was a collection of exquisite coral rock structures, including a pavilion, footbridges, a barn, a chapel, and an ornamental lighthouse, and a heavily wooded area with a nature trail and primitive campgrounds. It had become a favorite anchorage and picnic area for boaters. The very natural beauty and subtropical climate that have made the area so attractive may also bring its destruction. As millions of people have moved to Florida over the past 100 years, severe man-made stress has been placed on the delicate ecosystems of Everglades and Biscayne National Parks. While these areas, which have been tempered by stress, fire, occasional freezes, and frequent hurricanes are all part of the natural cycle, the question had been whether the natural realm could handle the combined stress of man and nature.
Well, we haven't had a hurricane here in almost 30 years. And the marine system was starting to clog up little things. Things were growing up. And the natural trend of things in a tropical marine environment is storms need to come through and clean out some of the areas that are overgrown. Unfortunately, on August 24th, Hurricane Andrew came through as a Category 4 storm.
Hurricane Andrew slammed ashore in the darkness of the new day, its screaming, pulsating winds toying with the 150-mile-an-hour mark it is our designated threshold to a Category 5 storm, the worst. Its marauding eye, spawning tornadoes and wind shears that magnified its deadly force, took direct aim on Biscayne National Park, then destroyed the communities of Homestead and Florida City before clawing its way through Everglades National Park and the southern portion of Big Cypress National Preserve on its journey to the Gulf of Mexico and Louisiana.
We were the first one to be hit by the storm, and we've learned from looking at radar pictures of where the eye of the storm was, that the north wall of the eye was just outside by a quarter of a mile of our northern boundary, and the south wall of the eye was outside of our southern boundary by about a quarter of a mile. So the Biscayne National Park was hit directly by the storm.
Roaring out of the east, Andrew's winds and storm surge hit the park's reefs first, then the islands and the bay before moving ashore through the pristine mangroves. Hurricane Andrew's toll on Biscayne National Park did not end when the storm left the park. For inland were the communities where most of the park's employees lived.
We kind of felt like we were fighting the storm from inside the house, that if we could keep the doors secure and the windows secure, we'd be all right. And afraid that if somehow something went, the pressure would de-equalize and the roof would go off. And all of a sudden, the family room roof, sections of it started peeling off, and the rain just, before that happened, it was pouring down the sides of the walls and coming out of the sockets. And then when that ripped off, my oldest boy was okay, but my youngest son, he's 16, he really got very emotional. He was very scared. And he was yelling that, my God, it's gonna blow, we gotta get out of here.
About 3:45 that morning, I smelled salt water in the air. And then we heard the noise of a howling sound. First time I ever heard that sound. You know, it was unbelievable, you know. And I thought we was gonna get more rain than what we got. And when the sound came over again, I smelled salt water again, but I heard sound of something like hail was falling. But it actually wasn't hail, so it was gravel off people's roofs. Had been blown about 2-3 miles away. So after the first portion blew by, it was something like a 20-minute, 30-minute delay before the eye hit. So I went outside to check my vehicle, see if my vehicle's fine. And I went back in my mom's house, wasn't nobody in the house. So I went back on the sidewalk and yelled, "Hey, Mom, where you at, where you at?" So finally I got near this lady's house and my mom hollered, "Here we go, we in here, we're in here, we're in here." So I went in that lady's house. 5 minutes after I got in her house was just like my mom's house. I mean, it got wiped out. So that's when about 12 of us ran in the bathroom.
Finally, I guess it was around 7 o'clock, I said, "Oh God, look, there's light outside, so the sun's coming up." So there's something very reassuring and secure in the sun coming up. It's a promise. There is a new day, and that you're gonna make it through the storm. It's gonna be okay.
The new day dawned to reveal death, destruction on an unprecedented scale, and chaos. For the next several days, the staff of Biscayne National Park, like everyone else in southern Dade County, could only deal with the basics of their own survival.
We were all traumatized by the storm. Everywhere you looked, you could see desolation and hopelessness, and nobody knew what tomorrow would bring. It's hard when you're dedicated, as many park employees are, to their work and getting back to wanting to repair what has been damaged and put the park back to normal, and then having your family standing in the street or not knowing where to go and where you're going to get out of the rain.
When they were finally able to return to work, the Biscayne National Park staff was in for a second rude awakening.
We saw one end of a coral reef destroyed, another end just totally untouched. Real patchy, and we're not sure why we saw that patchy information. The damage that we see in the southern end of the park, in the coral reef area, is mainly to the branching corals, the Acropora palmata, which is the elkhorn coral, and the Acropora cervicornis, which is the staghorn coral. We see breaking of those branches. What we see further north in the coral reef platform is whole sections of the reef just totally blown away with a very defined debris field on the western side of the coral reef. But what's remarkable over the overall ecosystem is we saw very little damage. Most of the reefs were literally untouched, and we don't know why.
The building that's behind me, that served as the Environmental Education Center, and that was a program that was run in the winter time, and we had school kids from Dade and Broward County come out here and camp and learn about life out here, and it was a very popular program, and I guess that's been canceled for this season. Most of the damage here to the island was to the mangroves. There were mangroves growing all around the edge of the island, and as you can see, they got pretty well beat by the wind.
Boca Chica Key, where we had another development, was totally demolished. There wasn't anything standing but some stone structures, and then some of those had some roof damage.
When I first saw it, I thought I was lost. I thought I was in another country, because the beautiful green trees and nice green grass and the wild animals just run loose out there, they was not there anymore. And man, and just working out there among, you know, the area with no shade trees, it did something to you.
In the bay proper, as the storm continued to move through the park, we saw more and more damage in the hard pan areas. And here again, we saw something very interesting. We see a lot of the gorgonians and soft corals staying in the water column or staying where they were, but we saw a significant loss of sponges.
This loss may be due to sediments churned up and deposited by Andrews water currents. Unlike the corals, sponges do not have the ability to remove the sediments that fall on them and block life-giving water flow.
We had, on the mainland, I would say that the height of the trees, the mangroves, were probably cut 50%. And on the islands, maybe a third down. But there was no vegetation. It was just a gray toppling of limbs that you could see from the air.
We have approximately 57 shipwrecks or sites in the park that we would identify as cultural material or have a historical nature due to early man or prehistoric man, as well as historic events. Problem we're having there is the damage is a little bit curious. It looks like it's damage caused by salvors rather than storm damage. So we're in the process now of saying, well, who really caused the damage? Did Hurricane Andrew cause the damage? And if so, how do we protect these sites for the perpetuity of the park?
Since the hurricane, we've been involved with this incident cleanup team, and they have come in and packaged our park and taken it to the landfill by the truckload. Our maintenance facility, which is directly behind me here, is temporary. It's the former site of our other temporary headquarters facility, and behind that was the maintenance building, which pretty much left the area completely. We used to have a docking system out here to my left, and that ended up about a half a mile down the mangrove shoreline. It's still out there, and we have to get out there and pick it up one of these days. We lost one visitor center completely, one visitor contact station, and a third visitor contact station was damaged about 50%. Our trail system was lost completely. Most of that's been cut open since. All of our signage, all of our navigational aids, all of our picnic areas and campground equipment, and an awful lot of campground vegetation. One thing that's kind of striking is that the park lost every restroom, and about half of its docks were damaged severely, so we're going to be unable to receive visitors for an awful long time. The estimate I've heard for facility damages is about $13.5 million just here in Biscayne National Park.
We'll need to rely heavily on the Denver Service Center for designing the new facilities so that they'll withstand hurricane force winds in the future.
An assessment of these new facilities behind you, they were designed to withstand approximately 120 miles per hour wind force. They have special roof systems on them, which were designed to withstand basically 5 times the uplift as downward force. And considering those buildings were not completely finished, all of the engineers and the park staff are fairly well impressed with how they withstood the force of the hurricane.
A real resource management problem is how do we document this? How do we measure and monitor the reef through time so that we can say how a system is going to respond to a major event like this? And it's real important that we get out there and collect that data so that we can be more predictive of what's going to happen to a resource and then try and anticipate some sort of countermeasure to protect that resource.
The prognosis for the future, time and money. We'll come back probably better than than ever. This park, I think, in 3 or 4 years, will be able to correct a lot of problems that funding and our amount of personnel have not been able to accomplish in the past. We're hoping that effort is facilitated through Washington and our Denver Service Center. And come see us in 3 or 4 years.